So tonight we are happy to have with us Jonathan Foster. He is, as you can see here, Principal Content Experiences Manager for Edge, Mobile, and Conversational UX at Microsoft. And he's going to be talking about AI conversation. So this particular topic's been kind of a popular one for our meetup, AI and conversation and bots. If you have been with us for a while, you may remember we had Deborah Harrison, who I think actually has worked with Jonathan, who talked about designing responsible conversations a few months ago. And then we had Karen Sheepy talking about designing the language experience for chatbots. So now we've got Jonathan to kind of talk about how you kind of put that together with customer journey. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll toss it to Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here presenting to you all tonight. Let's see here. I want to make sure I can move along. So yeah, that's what basically I have 3 teams under me at Microsoft that I'm responsible for that are writing teams. And those are the areas that we work in. We work in everything from UX to in-product help tips, kind of awareness content, and then over to some articles or whatnot you might find on support.microsoft.com, for example. So we cover the gamut. The biggest slice of what we do, though, is UX. I'll talk a little bit about my journey over that in a moment. This is what I'm going to talk about tonight, the future. I'm going to start with the future because sometimes it's interesting to set the context, because I'm going to talk a lot about my historical relationship to the stuff that we're doing, and I'll go into great detail about that in moments. I'm going to talk about designing personality, and then some considerations and caveats that we need to take a look at if we're going to go down this path. And some of this you may have heard of when if you had a chance to be here when Deborah spoke. She and I have been working together for many years, since 2013. She's on my team, and she runs what we call the content intelligence team. So if there's a little crossover, she probably went into greater detail than I would. I'm going to keep it a little higher level. And also, for those of you that were able to see the other woman who spoke about designing conversations, that's a critical part that I don't go into, but I do reference it throughout. So the future. As far as retail is concerned, and when I say retail, now we're really talking about brick and mortar experiences and how technology can enhance those experiences, because we already have solid retail experiences both online and through voice technology with Alexa. Obviously, that's the business prop for that particular voice-driven agent. But the unprecedented opportunity in store is to kind of connect this voice-driven interaction model to that experience. And so I wanted to take a look at how this possibility can unfold. For those of you that have a chance to see these Amazon Go stores, they're great. They're picking up signals. You go in, it knows who you are. You leave, it knows what you took, that kind of thing. It's our first step into a store, like I say, picking up signals, which is an important element around all of this. And this could be important where we need less human contact. And this story becomes super important as we look at post-COVID, what the post-COVID world will be like and into the future. Are we going to set into place, just like at our schools, digging into these online alternatives is a pain for us now, but sets us up for potential needs in the future. This is the same idea. So where there's less human contact, where a curated journey is optimal. I chose to call out IKEA because they have that iconic curated path that you go down. Imagine if that was actually run at a cadence, so you would be separate and you may not make much human contact there, or you might, but you might choose to interact with maybe a kiosk or something that could know something about you and talk to you in real time and help you differentiate, make decisions, find things, whatever. and also where traditional boundaries don't exist. So this is where we leave the brick and mortar and we extend into a virtual environment. So mixed reality, virtual reality, it's dependent upon a voice-driven agent to host in some way, particularly if there's no human involved. So we've already kind of covered some territory there. And then, as I mentioned, where we live, like the speakers in our home, and this is driving really a lot of the behavior that we are demonstrating as consumers, but also just as people with devices. One of the great statistics that Adobe came up with a couple of years ago when they were investigating, you know, is this a real thing using voice interactivity? And one of the statistics that I like to call out is that folks with speakers in their home are 4 times more likely to interact with an agent on their PC. So that's important to Microsoft because we're in the PC world, right? And the agent specifically that we're concerned about is Cortana, but through the Windows environment, you can also access Alexa. And so you can see the impact of just kind of people getting their toe into the water and how the speaker in the home could be an extension of the brick and mortar experience. And then also, what about when we're traveling? And this is where we start to get into what's interesting. We call it personality in tech and have historically, but really how does that personality persist in different environments and can represent a store, and a voice is a part of that. So the unprecedented opportunity is just what I'm saying, a brand expression, a new kind of brand expression in voice. And by brand expression, I mean, like, you know, social is a brand expression. Websites are a brand expression. This idea of personality plus an actual voice font that is designed and selectively pointed in a direction that supports the brand need of a given company is a very powerful experience. And it's a burgeoning space for companies. So let's talk about personality and designing personality. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I landed here. My background before I came to Microsoft 12 years ago was in film and television and a bunch of other industries as well as online retail. I came to Microsoft. I was leading teams that were writing help content. Then I moved over to Xbox, where I was first exposed to UX and had a team working on the UX and the language in that UX for the console experience. And then in 2013, I was asked to create a new team for a top secret project called Cortana. And we did that for 5 years. And then the work left, and we were already in the process of extending that to working with bots. We came up with a product that is available through the bot framework, Microsoft's bot framework, called Personality Chat. And the idea is, hey, we developed Cortana's personality, we designed that. Why don't we create a catalog of personalities for companies to be able to select to support their brand? And so we did that. It's a product called Personality Chat that's being leveraged by thousands and thousands of bots around the globe. We're in 9 markets. The vast majority of the usage is in English, but we're going to start seeing even more expansion. And we continue with that project, trying to figure out, you know, what kind of personalities companies might need. I'm going to show a little detail later about that. But then we start talking about conversation as an interaction model, and how you wouldn't necessarily need an agent. What I've been talking about, the Cortana informed, the bot feels like an agent, it feels like an entity. What if we're just using our voice to interact with an experience? And so what is the feeling of that experience? And again, we start talking about what's the personality of that experience? What is the brand? How are we supporting the brand through that conversation? When I first started here, and I'm going to go into a little detail on this because it's an interesting story too, is the voice and tone at Microsoft had to be unified. We had to have a cohesive way that we talk to customers that laddered up to what we want to convey as the personality of Microsoft. And then my work, as you see it going to the right there, it became more about personality, though I'll show how that connected to voice and tone later. But when we talk about conversational UX, Now we're moving beyond personality and just talking to our partners about effective use of their effective brand expression explorations. So it all started for me when I took the leap and went over to Cortana and the designing of personality. We were asked to write what Cortana said, largely in this space that we call chit chat, others call it small talk. Essentially, there's a domain that basically supports the value prop of an agent or of a bot, right? It is for Cortana to be a helpful assistant in a productivity scenario. But if somebody goes outside of that and starts asking questions that aren't related to that value prop, then we have this small talk area that we wanted to write for. And that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of interesting questions. And I'm going to show you some examples. Initially, we wrote for Cortana in a very practical way. So if we asked who she was,
I'm your personal assistant. You can tell me the things that interest you, and I'll keep it in my notebook. That way I can make suggestions and keep you up to date.
So very straightforward stuff. But if you wanted more information,
I'm not much of a swimmer.
We could find ways to have fun with it. And through that is how the personality began to show itself. But this wasn't anything that we thought was funny we could throw in there. We had done some intense thinking and continued to around what that personality is, and we had to be true to that. It had to be consistent, and it had to be aligned with the value proposition of the product. But then we found we curated a lot for Cortana, whether this was facts that were relevant to a season or a moment in time, or the classic was if somebody was asking for a joke.
A grasshopper walks into a bar. The bartender says, "We've got a drink named after you." The grasshopper says, "You've got a drink named Steve?"
So we gave a lot of thought into what kind of jokes we were going to give when they were asking for it. If a customer asked for a joke, why not give them a joke? As it is, we did a lot of thinking around what's an appropriate joke for Cortana to give. And this is a pretty innocent joke. It's an old joke, but we also had to make sure they were good jokes. And then we created categories around bad jokes and dad jokes and all kinds of jokes. We had a lot of fun with it. The idea is it was curated, again, in strict alignment with what we determined that personality to be. And so then we started to look for opportunities for engagement. So if somebody asks Cortana, "Are you smart?"
Well, I'm good with facts, like I can tell you who the coolest person in the world is.
Here we're obviously teeing it up for the response. The next person is likely to say, and it worked like a charm, "I'm not, who's the coolest?"
You.
Excuse me, I interrupted Cortana, excuse me. "Who's the coolest person in the world?" And Cortana says, "You." So we looked for an opportunity again to create a positive moment, something that might get a smile on their faces. But then when we looked through the data, and we would get data, but we didn't know anything about it. It was just raw utterances with no attachment to who said it or anything like that. But then we would aggregate that and see where there was, where there was groupings of stuff. So what we began to see was people were saying, "Hey, I'm not the coolest person in the world."
You're right. It's Fonzie.
So we had a fun time to respond to that and create perhaps, something that would bring people back to the experience. Again, we're way off task here. People are asking these questions, and we would select what we wanted to ask. And in there, this personality, this playful side of Cortana's personality would come through. But we did a lot of thinking about this then. Well, what is personality? And it's a lot of things, as you might imagine. It's the visual component. It's latency, if there's a delay. It could be the sound of the voice, all kinds of things. And what we realize is really it comes down to a design thing. It's a design affordance that smooths out the rough edges of a natural language interaction. That's what we really thought we could add value to. I want to stop and say, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me. Don't think of it as an interruption. Just send it to Larry, and Larry will be the one that interrupts me. So feel free to do that. Just because I realize. Oh, go ahead, Larry.
We haven't had any questions yet, but Paula posted something that really intrigued me, and I wonder if you're going to talk about it more later. She'd never heard of the concept of a voice font, and neither had I. Is that a well-established thing in your design world? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I will. In fact, I'm going to get to something. Let me.
Okay, yeah, we're coming to it.
That's a great question. I shouldn't take for granted that everybody would understand what that is, but it's a very interesting technology. But let me first go to put the button on this personality exploration early on. We really paid attention to research. People anthropomorphize. That doesn't come as any surprise. We name our cars, our vacuums. We assign personality whether it's there or not. It turns out that people with a higher need for control are more likely to be eager to assign a personality. So if you think about usability, that's a thing you might want to get ahead of, and something that we were very aware of, that it's beneficial to people. It doesn't just smooth over the rough edges. It actually reaches people where they want to be. And then this one's interesting too. There's a ton of research around all this. As you can imagine, this was early on, 2013, a lot of it. Ambiguous personalities are disliked. So that means you need specificity. And of course, brand people know you need specificity around your brand. You want immediate recognition. And as far as if you pursue what that personality bit of it is, you need specificity. So that means no dodging of questions. People actually want opinion and stuff like that. So this is a very interesting part of this whole voice piece. And I'm going to in fact, I'll just tell you about it right now. The voice font piece is that what you do is essentially, I'll just tell you how you get it, and then you'll know what we mean. What happens is you go into a studio and you sit in front of a microphone and you say all kinds of lines that have been written from you by this tech team. Ours happens to be in China. I partnered very closely with them. They're a great bunch of people, and they were super creative. But they basically have you reading a bunch of lines, lots and lots and lots of lines. For Cortana, it took months and months and months of work. And then they take those recorded lines and they chop it into phonemes, and then they put it in a database. But each phoneme, the reason that they have you read the lines and different lines and repeated is because we have different inflections in our voice, and we're trying to get this human sound, just the way that I'm doing that. And so they chop it up and categorize it. And then they have an algorithm that understands how to put a sentence back together. Text to speech is what it's called. TTS, we call it in the business. And basically what you do is you have text written. The algorithm understands what those words are and understands which phonemes to apply in which places. And in the end, you have what sounds like a very human-like a voice. And we call that a voice font. So if you think about this voice technology, this piece of research out of Berkeley in 2016 was pretty fascinating. The long and the short of it is they found that the sound of a human voice or a human-like voice is very humanizing, so much that if people hear a voice in an interaction through a computer, let's say, even if it's intentionally robotic, and even if the people in the study knew that it was robotic or that was their opinion, they still had a bias towards believing, a systemic bias towards believing that there was a human being on the other side of it. It's fascinating. The power of that is we're just beginning to understand. So even if it was robotic and they admitted that it was, they still thought there was a human being on the other side of it. Now, this is the part that I was going to save it towards. And this is me, flash forward. This was about 1.5 years ago. The technology that I said took months and months and months and months and months. And that's why building that out and making a choice around a voice is a very, very important, was historically a very important decision to lock down, because you had to invest so dearly. I sat in front of a microphone, pardon me, in a recording studio for 2 hours.
What you are hearing is a custom voice font of Jonathan Foster. To create this custom voice font required only 2 hours of recording Jonathan's voice.
So with the proper tool that they have for our partners, you can type in a line and it will repeat back just like that voice font of mine was able to do. So it's amazing how far we've come, and it's going to change the way the industry approaches it. Back in the day when we started Cortana, there was only one agent out there. It was Siri. There was a voice interaction that Google had called Google Now, but it wasn't until they decided to really lean into personality that they came up with Google Assistant. And before that moment in time, Alexa had been released. And now there's any number of them, right, across the industry, and people are building them themselves. It's a bot experience, of course. We have gazillion bot experiences the globe over, but to actually implement a voice in there is we're just beginning to go down that path, and the tools are making it a lot more possible. Here's another great piece of research that I like to share, because that's the voice part. Now, this is that personality bit, and this was a group out of MIT who were studying the effects of motion and story or narrative on people's response to robots, is what they were studying. And so they did this really hilarious study where they had this is called a hex bot or a hex bug, however you want to say it. It's not a robot at all. It just vibrates and runs around. My cat has a toy with a feather attached, and she goes wild. It just vibrates and moves around. So they brought, the first part of the study was they brought in a bunch of people. They gave them one of these. They told them to turn it on, and they gave them a big, intentionally, very almost comically large mallet. And they said, smash this. And a lot of people, surprisingly, couldn't bring themselves to destroy this bot. There was plenty of people that happily did, and it was a lot of fun and laughter in that particular part of the study. In the second one, what they did was they created one short paragraph, 4 to 5 sentences, as I recall, that said things like, "This is Frank. Frank tries very hard but bumps into things, but Frank is learning every day." And then they asked the people to do the same thing. They said, smash this with this rubber mallet, and no one in the entire study could bring themselves to do it. So the power of that personality in these interaction models is we're just beginning to understand, how deep that goes. And I would argue that we may never know how deep it goes inside of us. But if we're going to talk about research, I want to bring this man up, Clifford Nass. He was at Stanford. He started looking at this in the 90s. He kind of backed into it, and he became one of the renowned experts back then on the idea of people's relationships to computers and devices. Today, we would say devices. We didn't back then. So he was one of the first people that dug in here. One little side note is he was on the, I guess, a consultancy crew for Clippy, the famous kind of assistant in Word and some of the Office products back then that would pop up and see if you needed help. He wrote a book that I want to recommend to you if you hadn't heard of it. It's called The Man Who Lied to His Laptop. It's basically a look at that journey, and it includes all the things I've told you. Flash forward to 2020, about a year and a half ago, there was an article in The Atlantic that was on some of these ideas with regards to Alexa and Siri. And at the final paragraph or section of this long article, they called out Clifford Nass as being the pioneer of this thinking. So we all like to point our thinking now towards this individual. Okay, so now I want to take a moment and step back and just talk about the voice principles and how they relate to Microsoft's personality. Like I said, early on in my journey at Microsoft, there was a bunch of writers across the company, leadership in writing, that came together and said we have to have a cohesive understanding of the way we talk to customers. And it included also the brand team from marketing, because they wanted to make sure that whatever we came up with aligned with the personality we want people to feel around Microsoft products. So most companies have this. I've seen Facebook's. I've worked with Samsung in a partnership that we have with Microsoft on the UX writing side. And surprisingly, 2 of the 3 in both companies are very similar. And so those first 2 are warm and relaxed. This is where we get to be more conversational. less formal. We have a history of, you know, being not only an engineering company, but also being deeply invested in enterprise, large companies. And so there's a way that there's an expectation around how one would speak in that, basically that customer space. And so we wanted to move away from that. And so occasionally we'll have fun. We don't really lean too heavily into that because for obvious reasons, it's very hard to know when it's appropriate to be fun. But the Cortana experiences that I was showing are a good example of where we can land that. Crisp and clear, you know, this is a bunch of content people on this call. You know that this is just plain old fashioned good writing. And but we know that people's attention span is getting smaller or has gotten smaller. So we really have to be mindful about writing towards a scanning audience. And then simplicity is key. We have to make sure everything is clear as quickly as possible. Again, everybody here knows exactly the need for that. The third one, where companies tend to find their own signature, this one makes a lot of sense. We're a productivity company, Microsoft. And so ready to lend a hand is our third principle in voice. And it's how we show that we're on their side. We're always going to be there. We try to create paths where there's no cliffs for them. And it's really a great starting point, actually, because it puts your mindset as you're writing. If you're thinking about always being there for the customer, that it changes it to a real empathetic tone and a listening tone for sure. So I want to show you some examples. This, of course, is Microsoft's heritage. This is the blue screen of death. Many of you have probably suffered this moment. I certainly have. When the machine would crash mysteriously, you'd get this, and then you'd try to reboot or whatever. But the interesting thing here is I extract this from this bunch of words. The end user manually generated the crash dump. It's problematic on many fronts, but the end user, first of all, this experience is talking about our customer in the third person as though they weren't sitting there. Manually generated, that means that we're blaming the customer for something that they were doing. Generated the crash dump. What the heck does that mean? I don't know. Certainly the devs know, and certainly nobody intended for this to be a bad experience, but it's just an example of not thinking about the customer experience, and that's our heritage. So somewhere along the line, we changed it to this, and I call this the blue screen of empathy, because we did a lot of work and testing around this. Your PC ran into a problem putting the blame on the machine itself, and it even has that little sad face. Also ready to lend a hand, there's a barcode. So you might be able to be led to a place where you can find a solution. And when we released this, there was a lot of excitement around it in the press. And here's a CNET response that said, you totally crashed out, but you're so adorable. I just can't be mad at you. And I love this example because it goes right to the heart of what Cliff Nass was saying. People have these emotional responses that are significant, that are very, very present every moment of every day that people are interacting. But what we found out when we were working on Cortana was that all these principles, the voice principles that we aligned to across the company, were totally in support of, or we were in support of in our work with Cortana. We were in perfect alignment. We were reflective of the personality that Microsoft wanted to be. And so we came up with a bunch of principles, some that I'll go into detail about a little bit later. But we had a North Star, and that when we worked on Cortana, that was Cortana is always positive. And this becomes a very important one across a lot of work that we do. It doesn't mean that Cortana was chipper or happy or gleeful at every moment. It meant that the customer always walks away from the experience feeling good. We put it in the customer's perspective, not the design intention. So we arrived full circle at this idea of what personality is and realized it's a human thing. It's actually the honoring of the pervasive emotional reality people bring to our experiences every day. Now, beyond Cortana, I mentioned the project personality chat. Again, honoring this idea that we can bring this expertise to bot developers if we create this set of content that would live outside of their domain content. Again, to explain what a domain and what's not domain, if you have like a hot dog stand, well, you'd be responsible to design the experience to know everything about hot dogs, about your mustard, ketchup, all that, Cokes, whatever. If you have ice cream, you'd be responsible for that, answering the intents of the customer around those ideas. But if they fall outside and ask you something like, what's your favorite color, then we could catch you there. Really what it is too is what we found in our work with Cortana, and the value that we can bring developers is not necessarily in this fun area as it is in how to respond to the challenging areas. So a lot of the value proposition of personality chat is just that. But here you can see, here you can see if you ask our 5 personality categories, are you real? We have 5 different responses there that differentiate pretty well. And in addition to the actual authoring, Deborah's team, who, if you saw her speak, she probably went into great detail about this project and how she and her team are learning how to effectively train 5 different algorithms to respond according to their personality. And it's surprisingly successful. But here you can see an authored experience that starts over at the professional side with something that's very buttoned down. I'm digital. In other words, I'm not human, very straightforward. Whereas the witty one says, first of all, I'm a bot. Second of all, there is no second of all. So we're looking to have fun there and provide that for people where that particular personality style aligns with their brand and then formulates their brand expression. So designing personality, no, we're designing brand expression now. We start working with folks around the globe that want to build out experiences. They're not thinking of designing a Cortana. They want this representation of their brand to be totally on rails with their objective. The value of having this kind of brand expression is a long list. And here I've listed a few things that we're beginning to see that our clientele is responding to. I've already said, you can see registers in our minds as our brains as more human. That's not a bad thing, right? That's part of that research that I was referring to earlier, where it's very humanizing to hear a human voice, even if it doesn't sound like it's a human. But with that said, with all the benefits and the path that we're going down, and the research shows that this is what people are very comfortable with, I want to take a pause for a moment and throw some things out there that we like to take into deep consideration. But before I jump into that, Larry, is there anything that you want to, anything?
We had one question in, Andrew, if you're still on the line and would like to elaborate on this, but Andrew is wondering why Cortana, and I think others do this too, chose like a female voice and sort of a neutral one, not like an accented, you know, like a regional dialect or something. But, and Andrew, if you want to unmute, if you have anything you want to elaborate on that, feel free.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was just questioning why did you all decide to use like a female voice versus a male voice? I don't know, it's just like, I know traditional gender roles that like females are more in the assistant role, and it's like, was there any expectations of like, let's subvert the norm to like stop like playing to people's specifics, or just like, or like what was all considered into making that decision? And then also just a separate question, but similar, is like, why did you all, I'm mostly only familiar with the traditional US or pristine form of English, so I'm not familiar enough with like the UK voice to have any say on that. But like, why did you all choose to decide to use like the more Northeastern quote unquote accentless? But we all know that everyone has an accent, but yeah.
California non-regional, I know, totally. Primarily because in 2013, as I mentioned before, it was a very expensive endeavor. When you think of the kind of data that one person would have to provide, we finally got to a place. The Cortana experience has a male voice that I helped to develop actually a long time ago, and then it didn't release right when we wanted it to, which was really closer on the heels of when Cortana launched than when we did, but it's there now. And we've seen a lot of engagement there. The decision, though, is a good one, because when we actually did the research around the value proposition of an assistant, we had this idea of what is it. We went out and talked to real assistants, and the assistants we talked to were not predominantly female at all. There's a lot of male personal assistants out there in the film industry and personal lives, everything like that. The reason that we finally went with a female voice was, and there's a lot of research around this that's supported today, which is if you look at the value proposition, there's benefits to the male and the female voice. The female voice, what we wanted was someone who is accessible and friendly and not intimidating. A male voice, if you know, I'm going to be paraphrasing because it's a long time since I've looked at it, but essentially it feels more secure, more stable, but it can have a trade-off. So since we were going for a friendly assistant, we made the choice based on the data. Now, as you also brought up, I think maybe intentionally or unintentionally, the challenge is that the data that we get from people's opinions is also biased, right? So should we make a choice to kind of work against that? The truth is, like when we talk about, say, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that my team, Deborah's team, and I are working on right now is an inclusive language push, which means we want to make sure that when our products are engaging with folks, that we are making sure that we're not perpetuating stereotypes. And if they want it, they can see kind of this canonical understanding at the current time. It's very tricky business. And believe me, it's going to be a lot of work for me in the future. And I love it because it's about doing right by people, ultimately. So I'm going to get into this in a moment when I talk about a few of the principles that we had around Cortana, and it continues to instruct the work that we're doing beyond Cortana in my team's world. But it's essentially, you get into tricky waters when, you know, already recently Microsoft released Editor, which is a much more advanced version of spell check and grammar check. We actually you can check boxes about what you want input on. And there was a hilarious slew of articles that just came out because we decided to go with the, you know, you have to go through all these manuals of style and make a determination if you're going to recommend an editorial change. And the one that was controversial was 2 or 1 spaces after the period. And so we finally made the decision, okay, we're going with 1 because it's pretty universally accepted now. But if we're going to make corrections around this, we're going to have to go with that. And Tom Warner, who is he's the Verge writer, and he writes about Microsoft all the time, wrote this hilarious article about, okay, the debate's over, Microsoft determined it, which gives us this undesired authority around such things, you see. So that's a tricky area, and it comes back to this idea that we can't be telling people what they can say. We can't be forcing higher principles that are ours. You know, when you talk about around the globe, when we go and talk about our ethics in the US, for example, they're not universal as much as we'd like to think they are. There's plenty of cultures out there that don't agree with our particular set of ethics. It's hard enough, as we all know, to land consistency within our own country and within regions within it. So it's really a challenging space. So the answer is, it was expensive. We had to make a choice, so we did. Nowadays, we could make a different one. Nowadays, we're exploring neutral gender voices, and that's a good starting point. You know, whether or not it'll register as a non-gender oriented voice is up to the customer to determine. But we're trying to build that, and we're trying to get it out there. But that's because the technology is different today than it was back then. And we're looking into opportunities for the products we're putting out there, like Cortana, to have those kinds of options. And then also probably a bigger space for us is providing that opportunity to folks that come to our platforms and you know, our business clientele. As far as the cultural accent part, that's a same kind of a thing, but in the 13 markets that Cortana's in, they're speaking French, they're speaking Spanish, they're speaking Spanish in Mexico, which is very different from Spanish in Spain. But then we couldn't do the difference in Spain between, you know, cotillion and I don't know what the phrase is for the standard or the southern part of Spain or whatever. Forgive me, I'm kind of speaking out of turn here. But the idea is we did lean into that. And like I say, with the expenses being that they are of the technology at the time in particular, we didn't have a lot of options. So that's a long answer to that. The thing to know for everybody is we're aware of that. And again, remember when we launched Cortana, there was only one other one out there that had an intentional persona, and that was Siri. So it was just two at the time. Then Alexa came, and then some others came, and then it became a real understandable issue that we were trying to deal with. So there you go. I hope that helps. And that's brings us to responsible design. Excellent timing. Responsible design is critical, and the one that we've just talked about, is one that we think long and hard about. We're working on projects now to find a way to help people understand where the murky areas are, like never before. And it's been generated through this experience that we've developed, as well as the questions that very, very important questions that people are asking, just like the one that you just did. So there's a lot of principles that we align to. I just want to talk about a few here. And I'm going to go into detail on each one. If you saw Deborah's piece, she might have talked a little bit about this. But these are the ones I like to talk about. 100% digital transparency shouldn't perpetuate bad behavior. Inclusivity, of course, I mentioned that. And then embracing sensitivity, which is a very interesting area. So with digital transparency, what we're saying is basically we want the customer or human beings at all times have a right to know if they're dealing with a digital entity. And we early on said we resist the Turing Test. And that is the idea of, forgive me if you don't know about the imitation game, Alan Turing's story. I encourage you to check it out, because a simplified version that's used in tech today is that if someone can't tell if that's a human or a machine, then you've achieved success and the appearance of intelligence, and that's the only kind of intelligence you need strive for. We resist that. We believe that people need to know. A good example is someone on this side of the argument once quoted saying, I think any poker player out there has a right to know if they're playing a machine or not, right? It's like that. So we never pretend to be human. We don't measure the success of our experiences through duping people into thinking we're human. There's a hilarious contest in England called the Loebner Prize that I know about, where they're testing conversational technologies, and they put them behind a curtain, and then they try to fool the judges into thinking that they're human beings. A great book to pursue on that. I don't have a picture of it, but it's called The Most Human Human. It's a wonderfully written book about someone who was involved as, I forget the term, but basically because they were having these conversational agents behind a curtain, they wanted to mix it up with actual human beings. And so the judges didn't know if they were working with a human or not. And it's really fun exploration of that. And he was striving to be the most human of the human people behind that curtain, which was a fun thing. So moving on, never perpetuate bad behavior. This is an interesting one. The way that I've articulated this, and I continue to use this phrase, is it's important to keep in mind that Microsoft can never be in the business of telling people what they can and cannot say. However, it is incumbent upon us to make sure we're building experiences and products that don't perpetuate bad behavior. So it's a very, very interesting delineation, very, very interesting point on the razor blade, right, on either side. So if we're dealing with abusive behavior, and we do deeply, and that's part of the thing I mentioned with the personality chat work, we have a strong principle about being firm, about responding, but not to be judging, because for various reasons, we can't judge people for their bad behavior. However, we want to acknowledge basically the way that we do this is we acknowledge that we understand what you're saying, but we want you to know there's no there there. There's nothing there. So move on. Let's go to something that we both want to talk about, that kind of thing. And then this don't make a game of abusive language is interesting because essentially we thought it'd be fun to have fun around this, but then we didn't want to create a parlor game out of it so people were saying horrible things in their phones and devices and PCs just to demonstrate what Cortana would respond with. Striving for inclusivity, it's huge now. When we started this work, it wasn't really a topic of conversation as much. We were thinking about accessibility in our products. Now we're talking about inclusivity, and there is a difference. Here's a great example. If you say to Cortana, "You are fat," we immediately acknowledge that that's body shaming, and it gets tricky. If you don't respond, that's a response. That silence is a response, and silence feels like disapproval, and in that way, you're empowering the intent of this query. If you skirt the issue, if you get defensive and you argue about it, again, you're empowering this ugly statement. So we decided to kind of do a jujitsu move or a judo move, and we say, true, we just embrace it head on. There's a few ways to handle this kind of stuff, but each context is important to consider. I say here that humor is suspect because humor is hard. Humor is very difficult. You don't know what's funny to a vast audience of people. It's very hard. And we want to make sure we're never throwing anyone under the bus for the sake of a joke. And then also just plain old exclusivity is a painful thing, whether you're using jargon or referencing something that maybe everybody doesn't know, could be a quote from a movie. You got to be careful around that because it has a belittling feeling around people. So inclusivity is not only the way we think of it now, that we have to be sensitive with the language that we use, but also just how people are feeling included in an experience. And then finally, embracing sensitivity. This is a tough one because you got to say, well, why do you have to respond in a positive way to this query? What's the point there? Well, the point, because couldn't it just be cut and dry? This is just a device talking. The truth is we believed, and still do, of course, that, but we came to a point where we had to put a line in the sand on this. And that is just because we're dealing in this technological interface doesn't mean that we can't expose the fact that there's human beings on the other side of that. We can embrace the fact that humans ultimately are dealing with humans. This one, I'm gay, was a hard one for us. We kept trying and trying and trying, and everything sounded corny and fake or dismissive. It was really a tough one until we landed on cool, I'm AI. And this doesn't work in all markets for various reasons, but also this kind of response may feel as though you're really pushing that person in a direction as opposed to just saying, which the intention, and I believe the feel is here, is like, it's all good. Yeah, we're all special and we all have our own unique lives. So I've talked a little bit about the principles. There's a big caveat around that. But what are the caveats around this idea of bringing the power of voice and personality or brand expression into these retail environments? So first of all, the plain truth is the tech isn't there yet. Think about it. If we're going to put kiosks in an IKEA-like experience, it's going to take some investment. But before you get there, you got to make sure that that interaction is going to be smooth and human-like. Here you can see that something that you probably learned from the other person that spoke to conversational design, it's structured flows. There'll come a time when these are generated by algorithms and deep neural net models that know how to speak and how to formulate and can learn how to be better at that. But currently the most successful way and the way to control the conversation so that you don't have lack of intelligence or an embarrassing moment is through actually architecting and building them out. And here I say deep neural net models are problematic. It's not just that they can make a mistake that might feel racist or insensitive. It's also that they might be giving you incorrect information. A good example is this is just one we came up with. If somebody asks your bot, how long should I cook a chicken? And for whatever reason, the model finds that the most confident answer is 15 minutes. You can see you can get into problem with uncooked chicken. And then also just the fact that conversational understanding is running at about 96% success right now across the industry, which is higher than our success as human beings, but strictly conversational doesn't allow for signals that are being picked up. Like you and I are seeing each other. You're seeing my hands right now. You're seeing my expression on my face, even over the Zoom call. A lot more information is coming your way, and you're able to sort through that. These DNN models at this time are limited in that way. So the success for conversational understanding needs to be a lot higher. It's thought that once it gets closer to 100%, it'll never be 100%, of course, but once it gets really close, the industry will tip and will rely on this tech much to a larger degree. And then here's the voice design and the writing side, right? The design investment is significant. It requires expertise, and it takes a long time to get there. You got to start with you have to start with writers, and then writers have to learn this new area, conversational writing. We all understand it. It's kind of like, I remember a joke when I was working writing screenplays, was that everybody thought they could write a screenplay because they've seen a lot of movies. Similarly, a lot of us think that we can write conversation because we all speak in conversations every day, and it's not that simple, which I think those of you that have seen previous talks would that's not news to you. And then, of course, most people, and some of you may have seen this too, most companies will be all gung-ho to build one of these experiences, and they build it and they release it, and they expect it to be like a lot of things where you just release it into the wild. But the truth is, part of the manual work is the tuning. It's you've got to keep listening to what the customer's saying. You've got to perfect the way you're responding. It's like any UX, right? UX is never just checked off a box. It keeps evolving, and then you get into new contexts, and you have to rethink everything. And then just that this kind of learning is currently very labor intensive, and I kind of already spoke to that a little bit. And then the third piece that I like to bring up is that at this point in time, where we are in the world, people are still apprehensive around these kinds of technologies. Some go running to it with such enthusiasm, and those are the people that are going to help push the industry. But some are reluctant on another, on a number of fronts. Here's some I just call out: reluctant to give up data, right? These machines are getting smart about picking up signals, and then we have to find ways to make people comfortable with that. We also have to find ways to respect people's privacy, give opt-in, opt-out kind of moments in time. Those kinds of things are very murky, and we're still working through that. But really, the truth is, it's a trust issue with a lot of human beings on the planet, and understandably so. Personally, when I think about a machine being able to detect my emotional state, I get a little bit sensitive about that. I'm not sure, that's personal data that I don't think I want a machine to be able to understand, to be able to record. So there's a lot of issues there with trust and privacy concerns, and there's a lot of smart people at Microsoft really leaning into that, digging in and trying to find a way through that. Uncomfortable with the non-human, that's a real problem. Some of us have probably heard of this idea of the uncanny valley. That's this idea that as if you look at this, the valley is this graph that was created as far as people's comfort level with technology, and it's really significant around robots. So if you see these robots that start to look very human, there's something about them though that we can see as not human, and so we get the valley is the creep. We get creeped out by it. And so, some people are just not comfortable not dealing with humans. And then there's this other interesting piece to this that people may or may not know it, but there's been a lot of studies around how there's this feeling that a machine is arrogant, even when people know that they are correct. They still think that the machine thinks that they're that it knows more, and they're a little bit intimidated by that. So there's this interesting relationship to smarts around machines that human beings have. Who knows? Over time, a lot of this stuff that we're seeing in studies now may go away. But for now, it's a hurdle that we have to be honest with ourselves that we need to get over. And then this is the final section. The truth is, and I've mentioned this, we need the right people to do this. And we need to look in new places for the talent to build this stuff out, to design this stuff. Our side is the design side. We need to find the right people. A great example is the writing history at a company like Microsoft. It started with technical writers, and then we started to push into the consumer space. And by the time we got into the Cortana world, I was looking to find writers that had dialogue experience, right? Because we were going to write effectively, we were going to write dialogues. We had to know how, we had to have writers who were intuitively sharp with how people speak. And then the creation of a character, right? We're developing a personality, and the way that dialogue is related to that. That's a different kind of writing. And not that technical writers can't be skilled in that at all. It's just the pool of writers that we go to seek out the talent that we're looking for. And then the interesting thing is I speak to is there was a moment when I was working on Cortana with the writers that I had, and we were deep into this world of how do we respond to abusive and insensitive behavior. And it occurred to me, looked around the room, and I thought, wow, these folks from the artistic side are very well suited for this kind of work. They care about it, whatever. I'm not even going to go down the path of why that is. But an analogy that I always say is, for example, when I was in online marketing and I was a copywriter, right? My success metrics were when I could prove data around my writing, getting a person to do a thing, right? Convert, put something in the basket, click a button. How many people can I get to click a button? It's fine, it's all fair, but that's the success metrics. If you think about on the total end of the spectrum of artistic, if you think about a poet, the success metric for a poet, generally speaking, is when they can connect with a human heart or mind. And starting with that position of wanting to connect with human beings is a great starting point for this kind of work, where we really have to be mindful about inclusivity. We have to be mindful of the large vast of experiences around the world and how we want to connect with people. Again, people on the other side of these technological interactions, exchanges, whatever, these experiences. And that's it. That's the gist of my story that I present to you tonight. I hope you found it interesting. Please, before I want to open it up to questions, of course, in a discussion, but don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love to keep contact, and ask me any questions after this if you like, or just connect because you want to stay connected. I invite that, please do. So Larry.
This was certainly thought-provoking. We have a big queue of questions.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and a good range of them too. First of all, Heidi has a couple of questions about the voice fonts. Her first one is, can voice fonts be trademarked? Are they protectable?
We're working on that. We are working on that specifically. Not only the trademark piece, but me as someone who stood in front of that microphone. What rights do I have over that, right? Mm-hmm. It's just like a lot of the stuff that actors get into with a lot of work that they do. Where do they lose the tether to their contribution, their expression of themselves? It's it's a great question because it's super tricky. That's from the art, the person that creates it. And then as far as copywriting, the copyright effort is typically for like Cortana, it's around the entire experience, and the voice component is just a part of that. But I venture to think that it's easy to protect as IP something you've created that is a voice font. but we're really digging into how we can help people with that, because we want to create a burgeoning market around this stuff. So we have to be working on that. So we're working on it.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid I can think of 1,000 follow-ons, but we can say that. But Heidi had another question as well about, do you do any, and Heidi, if you're still online and want to chime in and elaborate on this, feel free to unmute. But she also asks, if there's do you do any effort to pair voice fonts with graphic fonts in your kind of the overall experience?
The closest we've gotten to that really is not with the voice fonts, but it's the idea of, and this is an interesting one, when do you make the choice of using non-graphical font, like letter type, right? When do you use hi Heidi.
Like, I was also thinking, you didn't use Comic Sans. So,
Right.
Sorry.
But,
like the font that's used in the UI. Yeah, that's a visual choice. Like for Microsoft, what is our font? I can't remember offhand. I should know because I see it every day, right? But we have a font that's ours, and we use that. So we couldn't use Comic Sans. That's for the customer, right? But what gets interesting is when we're interacting with people, is whether or not we use emoticons, right? Do we use a smiley face? Do we use glasses clinking? And that's based upon context. So a good example is when we did the hard thinking around that for Cortana, if we're in a chat environment where that was typically used, like let's say a text-driven chat environment, we might be more inclined to use a smiley face. But in regular interaction in the product where we don't tend to see that kind of icon, we would make a choice otherwise. So the context around that was chosen. That's just an interesting thing that doesn't really answer your question, other than the fact that we have a whole UX team that decides on the visual component of everything that we put out there, just like every company, right? And the font choice is part of that. And that font is also one that's proprietary, right? We don't release that necessarily. That help?
Thanks, Jonathan. And the next question is from Vinish. And Vinish Garg asks, and Vinish, if you're online and want to elaborate on this, but he asks about when you're developing the vocabulary in a conversational interaction, is the product voice derived from the brand voice? Or I guess he's asking about the relationship between the brand voice and the product, kind of between brand and product in voice construction. And Vinish, if you want to check in and elaborate on that, feel free.
Yeah, Vinish, can you unmute and give that a shot? No?
He's in India. He might have had to go to work or something.
Or bed.
Yeah.
Like or no, get up, I guess. It's like 6:30 there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let me see here. So I think, would you repeat the question, Larry?
Yeah, so and I'll just read it exactly as he wrote it.
Okay.
When you pick the vocabulary within the conversational interaction, is it derived from the product or is it brand driven? Or is the product voice updated to reflect the brand voice by default before any work begins on the conversational UX?
So, gosh, I'd want to ask him what he meant by voice, because I talked about voice, right? The product voice.
Exactly. Yeah. And
then there's the voice technology. It's an unending source of confusion that we haven't been able to find a solution for. I'll try it a couple of ways, because I've worked with some third-party brands, and it's up to them. They have their creative team, usually an agency, that is in control of the reflections of their brand. And they're the ones that go down the path of figuring out what the voice of that product, that company, sounds like. When it comes to the voice, as far as those principles, that is considered early on. That informs the conversational architecture that is designed at a later point. It's almost like in your DNA. So like, got to make sure that the words are reflective of the personality in some way. Like for humor, Microsoft's never going to throw anybody under the bus, and we're only going to be pursuing humor if we're clear that the customer wants humor. And in some cases, we might even just say, yeah, we're not really a humor company kind of thing. And then that's got to go down the path. When you think of building a voice font, now this might be the answer to his question. If it's around voice fonts, what we do is the crew that is determining the personality. So that's why I was involved in the male voice for Cortana, was because I held the keys, my team held the keys to the personality of Cortana at that point in time, as far as what was written. And that, it turned out that what Cortana said was where people identified most readily what that personality was. And it was usually likable, positive, all these things that we were really trying to get to. But it wasn't in the icon that represents it, and it's kind of animated states, which people liked, but they didn't associate that directly with personality. It was more like, it's how she says this, or how she said that kind of thing. So we were in the game of helping to determine what that male voice would sound like, because we understood the personality of that. So that might be another answer to the question. And if I wasn't able to answer it, I'm sorry. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. We can go back.
Sure, he'll watch the recording and can report back. Hey, the next question is from Drew. And Drew, as always, if you're online and want to elaborate, feel free to unmute. But Drew asks, has there or will learning be incorporated into any of the personality models? And would that violate the resist the Turing test principle that you talked about?
Learning, Drew, if you're here, could you open, because I'd love to ask you a couple questions so I can.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. So by that, do you mean like a learning model, like learning about, like Drew, for example? I have this algorithm and you say, hi, how are you? And over time it starts to learn about you and then get smart and can anticipate your next move kind of thing?
So it's potentially a big question, but it could be scaled down too for Cortana on personal computers. So even something as simple as learning the user's name could go a long way to communicate and make the conversation more personal.
Yeah. Yes. The only limitations around learning about an individual, which is really the thing we were all shooting for, is how you effectively navigate transparently around privacy concerns. Like, how do you get to a point, like if I was talking to you, I could very quickly say, do you mind if I call you Drew? You know, that kind of thing. And then we'd move on. It feels super huge if you put a big question in front of someone and say, Cortana says, do you mind if I call you Drew from this point forward? Although maybe it wouldn't, but you get the idea that we have to keep asking these questions in ways. There might also be things, I can't think of any offhand, where you would indicate something to me, maybe a smile over a comment that I said, then I would think, okay, I'm going to pursue that thinking a little further, where it'd be easier and quicker for us to do it. To learn about a person requires a lot of questions, and it's a slow process if we're going to be respectful about making sure the person's privacy concerns are first and foremost in the interaction, right? Because we are taking in data. And we don't know, and once the data goes there, we don't know where it goes, right? There's a whole line of thinking about forgetting. Like, yes, these models can learn about us, but can they forget? You know, can I leave? Can I get off the internet completely? Not very likely, right? But we want our AI-powered experiences to be able to do that when we ask them to. As far as the transparency, that part, the Turing test stuff, that's more like it's kind of a principle that's way up there, up high, meaning we got to do whatever we can to make sure that nobody is ever fooled by the experience. You know, I venture to think a lot of people on this call are familiar with deep fake, and that is the idea that AI is getting super good at appearing very real. There's a fast look for it. I think if you go deep fake Obama, some company created an Obama video that was completely generated by AI. The visual from the visual side, voice, and it's spooky stuff. And so there's a lot of people figuring out how we can keep that from becoming a real problem, right? Right now, the tech is super advanced, but we don't have a lot of time because this stuff's moving very quickly. So that's where I'm concerned. I'm less concerned about Google, Facebook, Microsoft, the big companies, because as long as you have people that are trying to be good to the customer in these very, very important areas, and there's big units or groups of people from each of these companies. There's a group called AI Now that has people from all the major companies that are there, and they're hashing out these problems of how we can be doing the right thing for people, for human beings. So there's a lot of thinking around it. When it comes to learning, it's more about, the story is more about getting the permission to learn about you. I mean, even you know, if I don't know you, I might be curious about something you said, and I might have to say, I don't know, you know, you don't have to answer this, or do you mind if I ask a little bit of a personal question because I'm interested in X about you? We do this as human beings all the time. The problem is some tech people forget that we do that, and they just think, oh, this is going to be a great experience. It's going to be magical. You hear that a lot. Well, people don't like magic if it feels as though they've been invaded in some way. So I hope that answers your question, or ask me back, add on to that if you like.
That pretty much answers it. I was thinking about maybe some kind of balance. So I completely understand everything that you just covered. Asking the name.
What do you mean by balance?
So privacy is definitely a significant issue. A balance where the chatbot or voice assistant can be more helpful, but without being too intrusive into privacy. And I guess that's a really challenging question that's certainly subjective. Maybe it's not answerable by a company. I'm not sure.
You know, from a technological side, you've got to have the information to be able to respond to it. The thing that people want is a personal experience. Like, you know, I have a phone, man. This is my phone. I have a problem, even though it's a losing battle in the UX area, which is I don't like getting a new experience and someone saying, like, I don't want to be welcome to my phone. This is like my living room. This is my space. I'm intimate with it. I've created this blue background, all that. It becomes mine. And so similarly, you know, you've got to really understand how people feel about their personal space. So, but being personal with them and making these leaps into magical moments. I have no problem with a magical moment as long as the person has opted in and wants to be amazed by that magic. And generally speaking, like I said earlier, you're much more willing to give over any kind of data if you can see on the other side of it the ROI, the return on the investment of giving over that data, right? I can see the value in my giving this up, so I'll give it up to you now. The trouble is, to date, and the industry's in a lot of trouble about that, it hasn't been asked, it's just been grabbed, right? And so, you know, we have something at Microsoft, it's a whole area of work called data dignity. Like, how can we respect the dignity of the human being and the data? Because data is just behavior and who we are. Like I said, my emotional state, that's me, man. That's my private experience. And you might see if I'm mad, but you're a human being, and I'm okay with that. And even then, I might not want you to see that I'm mad or crying or whatever, right? But a machine is so acutely aware that it gets really murky. So the main thing, I think, you said unanswerable. I think the big problem is it's just moving so quickly. We have to slow down. You know, think about it. Like, sometimes you'll be in a situation, you're like, okay, slow down. We got to think this through. We're at that moment with tech right now. We got to slow down and we got to think these things through before it gets too far out ahead of us that, oh my God, we got to invest so much to reverse that, right? Because I think anything's reversible. I'm not seeing a Skynet, you know, Terminator style future by any means. I'm very optimistic, but stuff can get away from you and it can cause damage. And you know, rectifying that can be very expensive and problematic. So the more we slow down and think things through, the less we're going to have to spend of human experience and human lives and just cash in the future. So anyways, that's some thinking.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hey, we had another question.
Yeah.
Marcia is here. Marcia's had some experience doing conversational design, but she also had an experience with Siri that she wanted to ask you about. So,
Yeah, it's no, not ask. It's just a fun fact. Siri always had a hard time understanding me. My first language is Portuguese, so I help work on the voice command for Google Phone for Portuguese, and up to now, since they started, Google Phone is the best, is the favorite in Brazil because people can actually do voice command. But aside from that, one day I was getting directions from Siri, and a friend of mine called, and I said, "Oh, Siri is so dumb." I was telling my friend, and Siri goes, "Marcia, I'm right here." It just freaked me out because my friend is like, "Did she just answer you?" I was like, "Yeah." That is the kind of moment that, makes you crack, because the machine is, because I called it out. I said Siri, and I think she thought that I was calling her. But it's interesting, those kind of things that kind of shake your world, when you're interacting with the machine. I thought that was a fun fact to tell.
That is hilarious. We hear those quite a bit, but that one popped. I have a question for you, just a side note. Sorry to bore anybody, but I have a friend who used to be on my team, the writer he led the Portuguese and Mexican markets. Hanan Leahy, he's now at Google. If you have a chance, say hi to him for me.
Yeah, now I am at Amazon.
Oh, gotcha.
Now I work at Amazon, but I'm not working with Portuguese or language or anything. But
okay.
The funny, interesting thing with experience with language design is when I did work at Apple, I asked them, I was doing writing and, checking machine translation. And I said, does it need to be of course, perfect grammar, but they have recently launched a new reform of the grammar in Brazil, and nobody was using. So I asked, there is this new law, they changed the regulations, and they said, no, we want the new ones. And I was like, okay, whatever. Everybody's gonna think it's funny when they are reading because they're not used to. When I was at Google, the tags were, the devs would come back and say, oh, she translated wrong. This is not the translation. And I asked my manager, do you want the proper Portuguese or you want the voice command Portuguese? Because the target market is the teenager, is like you don't expect a grammar perfect speaking or an older person talking, could you please call my mother? You're going to say, call mom, what's up? And I was just doing how a Portuguese would speak with their phone. And Google is a completely different approach. They said, I don't want grammar right. I want how people speak. And that's when the product was launched. I freaked out because my task was to speak with the phone, and the phone needs to write what I was speaking and would come exactly the intent of what I was trying to do, no matter how fast or how much slang I was using. So I think it's an interesting thing about language.
And it's an interesting thing, and it's also one of those points that I mentioned about authority. For example, when we spread out to the 13 markets that we put Cortana in, it became an issue of, is it formal or is it casual, right? Because in the States, we might talk really casually across the board, and that's accepted. Being from Portugal, and folks that know how it works in many countries, it gets complicated because you're making a statement. So in France was our only market that we made the design choice to go with the formal use of the language. And then you get into areas where, like in Japanese, I don't quite understand it, but it's been told to me, I don't understand the language at all. It's been told to me that you know, a female will speak differently than a male when they're referencing certain kinds of things. So you have to make another, it's a gender-oriented decision around the language that you use. And it just gets complicated. I mean, you're in language translation. It's the same animal. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you said about, adoption. And I was in Brazil when the answering machine came. And, as a young kid, I adopted immediately. My dad would call and hang up. And I would hear him saying, she's not answering. I'm not going to talk to that machine, that kind of thing. And then when the Google phone came, I imagined the same. I said, who's going to adopt that? Who's going to push the parents? It's going to be the kids. So you need to understand and speak with the kids. So the parents start learning how, lose that fear of talking to a phone and asking something. So we always need to find a way to hit the market.
Yep. That's exactly right. I agree with you. I agree with Google on that too. Larry?
I want to try to get in one more question before we wrap up. Jen asked, and Jen, if you're here, I'd love it if you'd elaborate on this. Jen used to work at Microsoft, and she has a question about kind of the change in customer-facing voice and tone at Microsoft now. Jen, are you still here?
I am actually.
Great.
Oh, okay, so I have to ask. No, I was just wondering when that shift happened, because you were talking about how, Microsoft had a very professional, not user-friendly tone. And I used to work in licensing support. So we were explaining to business users how Microsoft licensing worked. And we were coached quite a few times on not being conversational, coming across as that professional Microsoft voice. So it was very interesting when you brought out the thing about the blue screen of death and all of that stuff. And I was literally over here clapping like, yay, they finally did it. They finally changed it over and made it a little bit more user-friendly. But when did that happen? I was just kind of curious. And
yeah, so it really started to happen when I first came to Microsoft 12 years ago. But the unification piece happened about, 10 years ago. I wasn't involved with that. I happened to be kind of outside of that particular. In fact, a lot of it happened when I was digging into the Cortana stuff in 2013, because it was a long process, as you can understand, and it's people's part-time job. It's not their day job. So they came together with it. So probably I would say it's fair to say that 10 years ago was when we started really seeing it. And in Office, what was interesting, because in Office when I was there, it was help content. And so what we did was we tested. Back then, we looked at our customer base as consumers, IT pro admins, the people that were basically deploying the seats across these enterprises, and then developers, right? And so we wrote the same article, a number of articles the same way, in 3 ways. One was neutral, one was friendly, one was way over the top, wacky friendly, and then the other one was in the tone that we were writing in at that time. And the hilarious part was, people were more favorable to the way over the top in many instances, including the developer audience. So it was just this amazing study that we ran ourselves. And it just said, it just showed us in no uncertain terms, no matter what people say, we can see what they actually prefer. Now, that said, we still get kind of some understandable resistance from changing too much in some of those spaces, because like developers, they have to talk about code. So you don't get very far by trying to win them over with a friendlier tone or what have you. Admin folks, they really depend heavily on traditional jargon, traditional industry terms, though that's shifting because we're getting this whole new wave of younger IT pro admins coming in that are like, I don't care about that language that was established before I was born, kind of thing. And then you have the consumer space. Well, the way we look at consumer now is like the teams that I run are in the organization called end user, and that's not consumer. We're trying to extract it from that. That is people that are just regular people using our products, whether they're at home or they're sitting in an enterprise somewhere. Frontline workers is a term we use now, which is like folks that are on the job, like nurses and maybe people on the field at a construction site, this kind of thing. we consider them end users, even though the context that they're in may not be consumer oriented. But at the end of the day, they're people, they're real people that respond positively to the language. And believe me, we're not getting cheeky. We're just using more conversational tone, words. Sometimes we get colloquial, and the real challenge around it all is the localization piece. Because if we go too colloquial too much of the time, it's hard to translate. Even subtleties around language are hard to understand for a translator to distinguish between them. But we're determined. You know, I'm in that end user space, and I am determined to make that change. And it hasn't. I still go around advocating on behalf of it, just because some people don't see the need. Some people historically think that we're an engineering company. Why are you so concerned about that? But now, as we go down the path of these experiences that are becoming more human-like and responding to humans in their needs, the need for that kind of understanding of how language works is very important. And part of that is this, we have to have a structure around it. So I'd say I've never given a talk around the voice and tone principles across Microsoft to any resistance at all. Either they think, oh, that's somebody else's job, or they get really fired up that we're thinking like that now. A lot like you were going, yay! So, yeah. I ran a little over our time.
I think we're right at time, which is perfect.
Okay.
But well, I think Paula had to step out. She had another obligation, so I'll go ahead and wrap up here. But thanks so much, Jonathan. That was great, and I love how conversational it was. So thanks for modeling your work for us.
Thank you.
Yep. And everyone, we're recording this session, and we'll have it up online. We're an all volunteer team. Kind of depends on the workload that our video editor has. So could be a few days, might be a week or so, but we'll announce it both in the Slack channel and on the meetup page when it's ready. And if you all don't have it yet, do a quick screen capture of Jonathan's contact info there on the screen. But he'll be happy to connect with you. And like I said, if you didn't see the Slack invite in the channel, just drop a note to us on the meetup group, and we'll send you an invitation to the Slack. But thanks everyone. And oh yeah, and next month, Paula, it's not official yet, but I'm 98% certain that we're going to have a session on portfolio, kind of content strategy portfolio. I think it might be kind of a workshop-y kind of format, but in any case, there'll be something about content strategy portfolios for next month. We'll announce the date as soon as we have that set. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for chatting. Nice to see you, Heidi.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.